The letter arrived on an autumn morning when the Broken Spur was still and golden, the kind of morning that felt like a reward for surviving another season. Akari was in her studio, that converted barn where she kept her inkstones and rice paper, brush suspended over a half-finished painting of a mountain pass she'd never seen but could feel in her bones. The wind shifted. She heard hooves on the road. Not the heavy rhythm of the mail stage, but a single horse moving fast. She set the brush down without knowing why, but something in the sound made her stand. Gideon Krayle raised 3 children from nothing, finding them on a depot platform, bowed and waiting, with no one coming back for them. He gave them a home and a name and the kind of quiet love that never needed to announce itself. And now his past had found him. The question was whether the things he'd taught them, the patience of ink on paper, the stillness of a tea bowl, the stubborn loyalty of a man who works the land, could protect the man who chose them. Because Silas Vane had arrived in Cottonwood, not with a gun, but with papers and enforcers and a legal claim that threatened to strip Gideon of everything he built. And he didn't want blood. He wanted to watch Gideon lose it all. Morning at the Broken Spur started the way it always did. Akari was in the barn studio, her ink drying on fresh rice paper, the scent of sumi-e hanging in the air like a memory of Kyoto she'd never seen but carried anyway. Kasumi was in the tea house behind the main cabin, the small room she'd built herself from scrap lumber and a salvaged window, the smell of hojicha drifting through the open door. Takeshi was out on the north fence line, checking for breaks after a hard wind the night before. A good day, the kind that felt like it belonged to them. Then the rider came up the road. It wasn't the mail stage, but a courier from the territorial clerk in Prescott, pushing a lathered horse. He pulled up in front of the house and handed a sealed envelope to Gideon without dismounting, then turned and rode back the way he came. Gideon stood in the yard and read it. His face didn't change. That was Gideon's way, the same stillness whether the news was good or bad, whether he was looking at a newborn calf or a dead one. But his hand tightened on the paper. A small thing, and Akari saw it from the barn window, and she set her brush down. He called all 3 of them inside. They gathered around the kitchen table, the same table where they'd shared every meal for 15 years, and Gideon laid the letter flat, his hand resting on it a moment before he turned it around. The name at the bottom was Silas Vane. None of them had ever heard that name. But the way Gideon said it, quiet and careful, told them everything they needed to know about what it meant. He had never spoken of Silas Vane. Now he would have to. The story came out in pieces, the way old wounds do when the pressure finally lets go. Gideon had been a deputy marshal in the Arizona Territory in the early 1860s, 2 years before the fever took his wife Clara and the infant they'd only held for 11 days. He was a different man then, younger, still believing the law could fix things. He arrested Dalton Vane, Silas's only son, for a string of assaults and thefts that had terrorized a mining camp near Wickenburg. The arrest was clean and the evidence solid. Dalton had beaten a man half to death over a card game and stolen from the company store 3 times in 3 weeks. Gideon put him on a horse and rode him to Yuma. Dalton served 5 years and came out a changed man, quieter, humbler, the kind of change that only comes when a man sits alone with his choices for half a decade. But the Vane name was ruined in polite society, and Silas never forgave the man who put his son in prison. He'd been searching for Gideon ever since, 20 years of questions and rumors and tracking a ghost, and now he'd found him. But Silas didn't arrive with a gun. He arrived with a lawyer and a stack of legal claims against the Broken Spur's land. He wasn't here to kill Gideon. He was here to take everything Gideon had built and leave him standing in the dust with nothing. That was the punishment, the debt he'd come to collect. 2 men stepped off the stagecoach in Cottonwood on a Thursday afternoon, and the town noticed them before they'd cleared the platform. The first was a lawyer named Hollister, sharp-faced and clean-shaved, wearing a suit that cost more than most men in town made in a season. The second was a surveyor carrying rolled maps under his arm, the kind of man who measured things for a living and didn't care what the measurement cost the people who lived there. They went straight to the territorial clerk's office and filed a claim. The paperwork was old, faded, stamped with the territorial seal from 1865, a preemption filing that promised the land under the Broken Spur, including the water channel that fed 3 wells on the east side of town, to the Vane family. According to the claim, Gideon's purchase in 1872 was legally invalid. The land was never his to buy. Word spread through Cottonwood by noon. At the saloon, men stopped drinking to ask each other, could a man lose his land over a paper from before the war? At the general store, women stood in the aisle and repeated what they'd heard, each telling it adding a new detail. By the time the afternoon heat settled over Main Street, everyone knew the name Silas Vane, and no one knew what to do with it. Takeshi heard it from a friend at the livery, a man named Cord, who'd worked for Gideon years back. Cord pulled him aside and told him flat, there's a claim against the Broken Spur, and it's got teeth. Takeshi didn't wait to hear the rest. He swung onto his horse and rode home at a gallop, the dust rising behind him like a signal fire. The hearing was set for 30 days. Gideon had 1 month to prove his home was his. That evening the shock wore thin and left something else behind, something heavier. Akari reached across the table and took the legal notice from Gideon's hands without asking, and he let her take it. She read it the way she studied a sumi-e master's brushwork, slowly, looking past what was obvious to what lay hidden in the empty spaces, the strokes that didn't land, the space that held its own story. And she found it. The preemption claim had been filed in 1865, signed by a land agent named Ezra Thorne, but there was no final certificate of purchase, no record the Vane family ever completed the transaction. Under territorial law, that made it an unfinished promise, not a legal claim. It had the shape of ownership, but none of the weight. She told Takeshi and Kasumi what she'd found, then spent the night cross-referencing old memories, conversations with Gideon, letters he'd kept in a tin box under his bed. One letter surfaced in her mind. Ezra Thorne, dated 1872, congratulating Gideon on the Broken Spur purchase and mentioning he was leaving the territory that same year, the year the railroad reached Prescott. He'd moved south, somewhere near Tucson. Akari sat at the table until the lamp burned low. The missing witness was the key. If Ezra Thorne could be found and made to testify that the Vane claim was never perfected, that he'd refused to sign because the paperwork was wrong, then the whole case collapsed. But finding a man who'd left the territory 20 years ago was a long shot. And the clock, she could feel it, was already running. The next day a message arrived at the Broken Spur. Silas Vane wanted a meeting on neutral ground, the Cottonwood church, where the pews were worn smooth and the light fell through a single window behind the pulpit. He said he wanted to discuss a settlement. Gideon read the note and set it down. There was no point in refusing, and they both knew it. But Kasumi spoke before anyone else could. She would come, and she would bring her tea set. Gideon looked at her the way he looked at things he didn't fully understand. A long, patient silence that meant he was waiting. Kasumi gave him the explanation. "The tea opens the heart," she said. That was what she was taught, what her mother had learned before her in a house with paper screens and a garden she could barely remember. She would serve before anyone spoke. That was the condition. Gideon nodded once. He didn't argue. They rode into Cottonwood together, Kasumi carrying a wooden box wrapped in cloth. Inside was a cast-iron kettle, a bamboo whisk, a ceramic bowl glazed the color of rain clouds. She had brought nothing else. The church was cool and still when they arrived. Vane was already there, seated in the front pew with his lawyer beside him, Hollister, the sharp-faced man in the expensive suit. He studied Kasumi's box the way a man studies a tool he doesn't recognize and doesn't intend to learn. Kasumi knelt on the floor without asking permission and laid out her tools in the precise order she had practiced 10,000 times. The kettle, the bowl, the whisk, the small cloth she used to wipe the rim. She moved as if the room were empty, as if the men watching her were no more significant than the dust motes drifting in the afternoon light. She began the ceremony. The measured turning of the bowl, the slow pour of hot water, the whisk moving in a pattern like a quiet wave. She did not rush or look up. She let the silence do its work. And in that silence, she watched. Hollister could not sit still. He shifted in the pew, crossed his legs, uncrossed them, checked his collar. A man who had never learned that stillness was a weapon. Vane was different. He sat with his hands folded, a pocket watch open in his palm, checking it every few minutes. But it was not impatience she saw. It was something older, a habit of counting time that had lost its meaning. When the bowl was ready, Kasumi placed it before Vane with both hands. He took it, and as he raised it to drink, she saw his hand tremble. It wasn't from age or weakness. The tremor came when he spoke of his son's arrest, when the words slipped out before he could stop them. It wasn't anger that moved his hand. It was an old wound that had never closed, a grief that had hardened into something that looked like vengeance, but was not. She left the meeting, understanding what Akari had already begun to suspect. Silas Vane did not want the land, or the water channel, or the grazing rights, or the legal victory. He wanted Gideon to hurt the way he had hurt. That was all. That was the only prize he had ever been after. That knowledge changed the shape of the fight. It was no longer about property or preemption claims. It was about whether a man could be made to pay for doing his job 20 years ago, and whether the people who loved him could stop the accounting. Takeshi was not a man of paperwork or silences. He did not read legal notices the way Akari did, searching for the hidden stroke, nor did he sit across from an enemy and watch his hands the way Kasumi did, reading truth in the spaces between movements. He knew the land and the people who worked it, and he understood that the law was not the only thing that held a ranch together. He saddled his horse before dawn the next morning and rode without telling anyone where he was going. The first stop was the Webb place, 12 miles east of Cottonwood. Aldous Webb was in his yard mending a harness when Takeshi rode up. They had known each other for 10 years, the way men in the territory know each other, by the work they do and the word they keep. Takeshi did not waste time on pleasantries. He asked one question. What did Gideon do when you needed help? Webb set the harness down and thought about it. Then he told a story about the winter of '79, when a storm took down 3 miles of his north fence and his herd scattered into the canyon. Gideon had shown up at dawn with a string of horses and a coil of wire, not asking what happened or who was at fault. He just started working. He drove the strays 30 miles back to Webb's gate, working until the fence was whole and the herd was counted. He did not stay for supper. He did not mention it again. Takeshi thanked Webb and rode on. The Stanton place was next, a hard Scrabble spread on the edge of the dry wash. Pearl Stanton came to the door with flour on her hands, a woman who had buried 2 children and a husband and still got up every morning to feed the chickens. Takeshi asked her the same question. She told him about the summer her husband was laid up with fever, the kind that turns a man's bones to water and leaves him helpless for weeks. The well had gone dry on a Tuesday. By Wednesday, Gideon was there with a shovel and a team of horses, digging a new one. He worked for 3 days in the heat, his shirt soaked through, until the water came. He did not ask for payment nor mention it afterward. Takeshi made 6 more stops that day. The Corderos, the Hales, the Bells, every one of them had a story. Every one of them remembered. He did not ask them to fight or carry guns or stand in the way of Vane's enforcers. He asked them to remember the truth of the man they knew and to say it out loud if called upon. That was all. A community's memory is a kind of law too, the kind that cannot be filed away in a clerk's drawer or erased by a lawyer's argument. It lives in the people who were there, who saw what happened, who still carry the weight of what they owe. The hearing was held in Cottonwood's tiny courthouse, a single room with a raised platform at the front and bench seats that creaked under the weight of every person who sat in them. The magistrate was a woman named Laura Dillard, appointed from Tucson 6 months earlier. She was small-framed, with iron-gray hair pulled back tight, and the kind of patience that only comes from having heard every excuse men tell themselves. The room called her steel behind her back, and she did not seem to mind. Vane's lawyer Hollister opened with the preemption claim. He held it up for the room to see, faded paper stamped with the territorial seal, claiming 640 acres that included the Broken Spur. He read the relevant lines aloud, his voice smooth as oil, letting the age of the document do half the work for him. A paper from 1865, before the war was even over. Surely that carried weight. Gideon's lawyer was an old man named Birch, a retired territorial judge who took cases for the fee and the company. He rose slowly, adjusted his spectacles, and spoke in a voice that sounded like dry leaves. The claim, he said, was never perfected. No survey had been filed. No certificate of purchase had been recorded. No payment had been made to the Territorial Land Office. A preemption filing without those things was a piece of paper with a stamp on it, not ownership. Hollister came back fast. He argued that the Vane family had made improvements to the land in the 1860s. A cabin, a well, a fenced enclosure, and under territorial law, those improvements constituted equitable title. The family had treated the land as theirs, worked it, lived on it. That meant something. Magistrate Dillard listened to both sides without moving. When they finished, she sat in silence for a long moment, her hands flat on the desk in front of her. Then she ruled. The claim had enough merit to proceed to a full trial. She gave Gideon 30 days to prepare his defense. The clock was now running. And Silas Vane was not a man who waited quietly. 3 days after the hearing, a party appeared on the road to the Broken Spur. Takeshi spotted them from the corral, 5 shapes moving through the heat shimmer, and he knew the set of them before they got close. Hollister in his dark suit, the surveyor with his oilcloth map case, 2 hired hands from the Vane outfit, hard men who took their pay and kept their mouths shut. They did not stop at the gate. They stepped past the fence line without knocking, without calling out, without any of the small courtesies that men in the territory observed even when they came bearing bad news. The surveyor unrolled his maps on the ground, weighting the corners with stones. The hired hands carried a sack of stakes, sharpened at one end. They began driving them into the pasture, marking new property lines as if the land was already Vane's. Akari came out of her studio. She had been working on a painting of the mountain pass, the one she had never laid eyes on but could feel in her bones like a held breath. Her brush was still in her hand, a fine line of ink drying at the tip. She stood in the doorway and watched them for a moment. Then she saw what they were trampling. The garden where she grew the persimmon trees that supplied her ink. The small grove she had planted from cuttings, watered by hand through 2 dry summers, coaxed into life in a climate that had never known a persimmon. The trees were young, barely taller than her shoulder, but they were hers. She had made them grow. She did not raise her voice. She did not call for Takeshi or Gideon. She walked past the surveyor, past Hollister, past the 2 hired men, and stopped at the nearest stake. It was driven deep into the ground, marking a line that cut through the edge of her garden. She bent down, wrapped her hand around the wood, and pulled. The stake came out of the ground with a sound that belonged to a tooth being drawn. She carried it to the porch and set it down, leaning it against the wall. Then she turned, faced the men, and bowed once. A formal bow, the kind her mother had taught her, the kind that offered respect and held distance in the same motion. Then she walked back inside and closed the door. The surveyor looked at Hollister. The lawyer stood motionless, his sharp face unreadable. The hired men waited for an order that did not come. After a long silence, Hollister turned and walked back to his horse. The others followed. They left the other stakes in the ground, white and raw in the afternoon light. They would not leave without a fight. But the fight would not be a violent one. It would be measured in inches, in patience, in the small acts of refusal that accumulate into something that cannot be ignored. Akari understood what the case came down to. Without Ezra Thorne's testimony, the preemption claim carried the weight of an old document and the stamp of a territorial seal. It did not matter that the claim was never perfected. A piece of paper that looked official could hold up in court if no one stood to say otherwise. She needed the man who had been there, who had refused to sign, who could tell the magistrate what really happened in 1865. She went through Gideon's tin box that night, the one he kept under his bed with the things he did not look at but could not throw away. Old letters, a worn leather badge from his Marshal days, a lock of hair wrapped in cloth. Near the bottom, she found what she was looking for. A letter from Ezra Thorne, dated 1872, congratulating Gideon on the purchase of the Broken Spur. The handwriting was careful. The ink faded to brown. At the top of the page, a return address. Trace Alamos, a town south of Tucson. Takeshi found her at the kitchen table with the letter spread open, reading it by lamplight. He did not ask what she was doing. He sat down across from her and waited. She told him what she needed, someone to ride to Trace Alamos, find Thorne, bring him back, or bring his words. A 5-day round trip through Apache country, with the autumn storms already starting. The passes would be treacherous, the rivers swollen. Takeshi did not hesitate. He said he would go. The next morning, before the sun cleared the canyon rim, Akari gave him the letter and a folded piece of her sumi-e paper. On it, a single stroke of ink, bold and unbroken from top to bottom. The symbol for endurance. She did not explain it. She did not need to. She told him, "Bring Thorne back, or bring his words." Takeshi folded the paper into his coat pocket, swung onto a borrowed horse, and rode out through the gate. The family stood on the porch and watched him disappear into the dust, a single figure growing small against the wide autumn sky. The wind chime turned in the breeze once, and then was still. A week passed, the days long and quiet in that heavy way that presses down on a house and everything inside it. Takeshi was gone, but the stakes still stood in the pasture, and every morning Akari walked past them on her way to the studio without looking at them. Then a messenger came from town. Silas Vane wanted to meet Gideon face to face, alone, at the Broken Spur. No lawyers, no witnesses, just the two men who had carried the same weight for 20 years. Gideon read the message and said he would go. There was no point in refusing. If Vane wanted to talk, let him talk. But Kasumi spoke before anyone could agree to the terms. She said she would serve tea before any words were exchanged. That was her condition. Gideon looked at her for a long moment, the way he looked at things he did not fully understand but had learned to trust. He nodded once. Vane arrived the next afternoon, riding alone. He dismounted with the deliberation of a man who wanted to show he was not in a hurry. He had expected to find Gideon on the porch, waiting, ready to negotiate. Instead, he found a woman in a silk kimono kneeling on a straw mat beside a cast-iron kettle, the steam rising in a thin white column. Kasumi did not look up. With a single motion of her hand, precise and unhurried, she gestured to the mat across from her. Vane stood there a moment, caught between the expectation of a confrontation and the reality of a tea ceremony. Then he sat. She performed the full ceremony, the measured turning of the bowl in her hands, the slow pour of hot water, the bamboo whisk moving in a pattern that looked like a quiet wave. She wiped the rim of the bowl with a small cloth, turned it twice, and placed it before him. Every movement was deliberate, every silence stretching longer than the one before it. Vane was forced to wait. He could not speak until she finished. He could not make his demands, could not lay out his terms, could not do any of the things he had come to do. He could only sit and watch a woman perform a ritual he did not understand, in a language he did not speak, and wait for her to finish. And in that stillness, something broke. He picked up the bowl and held it in both hands, the warmth seeping into his palms. Without looking at her, he said, "You're protecting him. Why?" Kasumi did not answer. She reached for the kettle and refilled his cup, the water pouring in a thin, even stream. She set the kettle down and folded her hands in her lap. Vane drank. And for a moment, sitting there with the tea bowl in his hands and the autumn light falling across the mat in long slants, he looked like what he was. Not a land baron, not a man who had spent 20 years hunting his enemy. An old man who had carried a stone too long and did not know how to set it down. He left without making his demand. He stood, walked to his horse, and rode back the way he came. The tea bowl sat empty on the mat, a single drop of liquid at the bottom catching the light. The crack had opened, enough to change the shape of what was coming, though not enough to win the fight. Not yet. It took Takeshi 3 hard days to reach Tres Alamos. The town was a scatter of adobe buildings in a dry valley, a place that looked like it had been built by people who had given up on finding better ground. Its main street dust and dog packs and a single water pump that groaned every time someone worked the handle. He found Ezra Thorne living in a one-room cabin at the edge of town, set back from the road behind a fence with more gaps than boards. The door was answered by a man bent with age, his shoulders curved forward like they had carried something heavy for too long, a persistent cough rattling in his chest from years of sleeping cold and eating worse. He looked at Takeshi with the suspicion of a man who had learned that strangers rarely brought good news. Without preamble, Takeshi explained the situation. The facts, the timeline, what was at stake. He kept it brief the way Gideon had taught him. Then he showed Thorne the letter from 1872, the one Akari had found in the tin box with its ink faded to near illegibility, and Thorne took it in his hands and held it close to his face, squinting. He set it down and was quiet for a long moment. "I never signed that preemption," he said. Vane's agent came to my office in 65 with the papers already filled out. Wanted me to backdate them to 62, make it look like the claim was filed before the territory was even organized. I told him to leave my office and not come back." He said it flat, without anger, the kind of statement a man makes when he has told the truth so many times he is tired of hearing himself say it. When Takeshi asked if Thorne could come to Cottonwood and testify, the old man shook his head, saying the cough was worse in the mornings and the trip would take 4 days each way, and he was not sure he had 4 days left in him. But he could give a sworn statement, put his name on paper the same way he had refused to back in 65. They went to the local sheriff's office together. Thorne dictated his statement while the sheriff wrote it down, a slow process that required Thorne to stop and catch his breath between sentences. He described the agent's visit, the attempted bribe, his refusal to sign, the records he had kept, and the fact that no Vane certificate of purchase had ever been filed under his watch. When it was done, the sheriff signed his witness and stamped it with the county seal. Takeshi folded the paper into oilcloth and pressed it flat against his chest, buttoning his coat over it. He rode out of Tres Alamos before the sun touched the horizon. On the second day, the storm caught him, a lightning storm that came down from the mountains without warning, the sky cracking open in sheets of cold rain. But he kept riding, the paper wrapped tight against his chest, dry and safe. He did not stop until he reached the Broken Spur gate 3 days later, his horse blown and his hands raw from holding the reins through the weather. The statement was not the same as a living witness, but it was a start. The trial opened in Cottonwood on a Tuesday morning, with the courtroom packed before the magistrate even took her seat. Men lined the walls with hats in hand, while women fanned themselves against the heat, the air thick with wool and dust, and too many bodies crammed into a small room. Every bench was full, and those who could not find room pressed against the door frame, craning their necks to catch a glimpse. Hollister presented the Vane case with the polish of a man who had done this 100 times, holding up the original preemption claim, the faded paper catching the window light. He unrolled the surveyor's maps and pointed at the lines that marked the Vane family's claimed boundaries. The surveyor took the stand and testified that the cabin and well appeared to date from the 1860s, consistent with the family's claim of improvement. Then Mr. Birch rose. The old lawyer moved slowly, his joints complaining, his voice thin as paper, but his questions landed where they needed to. Birch asked the surveyor how he knew the cabin was built in 1865 and not after, and the surveyor hesitated before admitting he had no way to date it precisely. He had taken Hollister's word based on the documents provided, never examining the timber or the nails, none of the things a man would do if he were actually trying to determine when a building went up. He had simply assumed. Birch let the silence stretch, then thanked the surveyor and sat down. He entered Ezra Thorne's statement into evidence, and the magistrate took the oilcloth packet, unwrapped it carefully, and read it aloud in a voice that was steady and unhurried. She read every word, from the description of the attempted bribe to the final declaration that no Vane certificate of purchase had ever been filed. The room was silent. No one shifted, no one coughed. The only sound her voice and the occasional creak of a bench as someone leaned forward to hear better. Hollister stood and objected, saying the statement was hearsay, that Thorne was not in the room, could not be cross-examined, and the document had no standing. Magistrate Dillard looked at him over the top of her spectacles and said, in a voice that carried no heat and no uncertainty, that Ezra Thorne had been the land agent in question, and his refusal to sign the preemption was not hearsay. It was direct knowledge of an event he had witnessed and participated in. The statement would stand. Akari watched Vane's face during the reading, expecting anger, expecting the tight jaw of a man watching his case crumble. But that was not what she saw. Vane did not look at the judge or at Hollister. He looked at Gideon across the room, and there was something in his eyes that was not defeat. It was exhaustion, the kind that borders on surrender, the kind that comes from carrying a weight so long you have forgotten what it felt like to put it down. The trial was not over yet, but the shape of it had shifted, and everyone in that room knew it. The next morning the courtroom filled again, but something had changed. The air was different, thinner, waiting. People spoke in low voices, not because they were told to, but because the shape of the room had shifted overnight, and no one knew what it would settle into. Hollister stood and asked for a recess, holding a telegraph in his hand, the paper trembling slightly at the edge, and said he had received word from Silas Vane. His client wished to withdraw the claim. The room stirred as men looked at each other, and a woman near the back let out a breath she had been holding since the trial began. But Magistrate Dillard did not accept. She looked at Hollister over her spectacles and said the record would not be closed until it was complete, that she wanted a final hearing, wanted the truth on paper, signed and sworn, so that no one could come back in 5 or 10 years and file the same claim again. She was not going to leave a door open. Vane took the stand, walking past his lawyer without looking at him, past the gallery of faces he did not recognize, past the 3 siblings who had spent a month defending their home. He sat down in the witness chair and placed his hands flat on the arms, the way a man does when he has decided to stop holding on. Under oath, he said the words no one expected to hear. He admitted he knew the preemption was never perfected, that he had filed the claim in desperation, hoping to force a settlement, hoping to make Gideon pay for what happened to his son. He said it all in a voice that was flat and tired, the kind of voice that comes from a place where anger has burned out and nothing has grown to replace it. Magistrate Dillard ruled against Vane with prejudice. The Broken Spur belonged to Gideon Krayle, now and forever, and the claim was dead, could not be refiled. Vane left the courthouse without speaking to anyone, his hired men following him out into the street, their boots loud on the boardwalk before fading, and the door swung shut behind them. There was no triumph in the room, no cheering, no handshakes, no celebration. Only the quiet of having survived something that could have been much worse. The kind of quiet that settles into a house after a storm passes, when you step outside and see what is still standing and what is not. They rode home together, the 4 of them, through the late autumn light. The sun hung low and golden, turning the dust they kicked up into something like smoke. The road and the gate were familiar, and the porch where Gideon had stood 1,000 times looking out at nothing in particular was waiting for them. Akari's garden was still trampled, the persimmon trees bent with torn leaves, the ground churned by boots and stakes. She looked at it for a moment and said nothing. She would plant again in the spring because that was what you did. Kasumi's tea house was untouched. The straw mat was still there, the kettle cold, the bowl clean and waiting. No one had crossed that threshold or touched her tools. The barn stood solid, the horses nickering at the sound of footsteps. The wind chime caught the breeze and turned once, its copper and shell catching the light like something alive. Gideon sat on the porch, not saying much because that had never been his way. He looked at the 3 of them standing in the yard, and the silence stretched long enough to be uncomfortable, but it was not. It held everything that needed to be said. Then he spoke in careful Japanese, the word Kenji had taught him years ago, when the children were still small and the language was new and strange on his tongue. He said it slowly, the way you say a word you have carried for a long time and want to make sure it lands right. Kazoku. Family. Akari smiled. Kasumi bowed her head. Takeshi walked up the steps and clapped Gideon on the shoulder once, the way men do when words are not enough, then turned and walked toward the barn, his boots leaving prints in the dust. The wind chimes sounded in the evening breeze, and the Broken Spur was still standing. Akari in her studio, the brush moving across rice paper. Kasumi at the tea house, the kettle beginning to warm. Takeshi walking the corral, checking the fence one more time. Gideon in his chair on the porch, watching the light fade. What they saved was not just the land, but the bond that made it home. The law of the frontier may be written in deeds and documents, but the law that holds is written in loyalty, the willingness to wait, serve, and ride through storms. If this story stayed with you, subscribe so you do not miss the next tale from the territory. Leave a comment with your city. I want to see how far this story travels.